just a notice or hear something in the back end to let you know about that. So thank you so much, everybody who has been able to join. I see some friendly faces on the line. So thank you so much for joining us here tonight, and some waves too. Awesome. Even though we can't be together in person, I do love the interactivity. So thank you so much. Welcome, as Jen said, to the first public input session for the City of Kawartha Lakes Trails Master Plan update. We really appreciate your time here tonight. My name is Claire Bashinsky. As I said, I'm a senior project manager with CIMA Plus, and I'm managing this project, but really working collaboratively with my colleagues who join me here this evening, Gilly Thompson, Peter Brox, and Sam Legere. If you guys want to say a hi, hello. Peter actually happens to be a local resident as well, so we've been sending him out and giving us all of the good background information and a wonderful, great context and understanding of the area, while some of us are based elsewhere. But we've been working with Jen and her colleagues, as she said, over the past couple of months to really start to just scratch the surface of what a Trails Master Plan update means for the City of Kawartha Lakes. And it's culminating in the completion of this first phase of work through a number of different engagement opportunities that we've been hosting and having. We'll go into some of the details around that, as well as some of the background technical work that we've been working on. So we're really happy to present that to you here tonight. For those who have joined us or me or some permutation of this group before, some of this information you may have seen before. For others, this may be somewhat new. So we try to keep it as inviting and interactive as possible, but a lot of this will be information sharing as much as we can. So without further ado, we just wanted to get a sense of everybody that's here and how you have possibly participated before in this process. And we're going to do that using a tool called Menti. And that's an interactive, anonymous polling tool. And you either use your smartphone or you can bring up a web browser like Chrome or Internet Explorer or something else. And you type in www.menti.com. And when you get there, you will type in the code 37248566. I'm just going to type that into the chat. Oh, thank you. Gilly is already on top of it. Thank you so much. And I'm going to start presenting as well, because there'll be some questions that hopefully pop up on your screen. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see those happening in real time. And I'm seeing some questions possibly coming through. If you can't necessarily participate in this, that's okay. It's just really getting the sense of the group. I know Gilly's going to be monitoring the chat as we go, but the first question is, are you a resident of the city? And whether or not that's seasonal or year round. I know we have about 25 people online, so I may not be looking for the max to that, but looking around that number, we have about 7 questions for you coming your way. Okay. So I'm seeing a slower uptick on this one. So just in the interest of time, we're probably going to move on to the next question, but that doesn't mean that your information is not being logged. It's really just getting a sense of what you're coming here from in terms of your context. Oh, seeing some more coming in, so I'm glad I wasn't rushing through on that. Okay. And once we get a sense of that number, then I'll be able to know what to wait for going forward.
Good morning.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question, just to let everyone know. And were you able to complete the online survey through our Jump In page previously? There's been some great responses. You'll hear a little bit of that summary later on in the slide deck, but we'd just like to get a sense of who's been engaged so far and who hasn't. No judgment if you haven't at all. That's why we have sessions like this and different opportunities for engagement. So again, very anonymous and just good to know how everybody has been involved so far. I'm seeing we're hitting around that 12 number. So we've got a little bit more, which is great. Wonderful. So some existing participation, that's great. Thank you for providing your comments so far, and some new faces to getting involved in the process too, which is excellent to see. That's wonderful. Seeing a couple more come in, so don't want to rush it. And if anybody is just jumping in now, it's not like you get locked out at any point. You just join in as soon as you can. Okay. I'm going to move on to that next question. I hope that's okay. So how frequently would you say that you currently use the trails in Kawartha Lakes right now in terms of the general frequency? We know that we can't all have the exact same week every single week or the exact same day every single day. So in general speaking, how often would you say you're getting out there and using the trails currently? Whatever form you do. Excellent. And we have a similar question through our Jump In page. So we'll also be able to compare those a little bit. And you'll see a bit later that we do see pretty high frequency of use, not surprising, considering the opportunities and the amazing linkages that are available now. I think the max responses we saw was around 16, so I will keep an eye out for that, just in case. Excellent. So again, pretty frequent, a couple of times a week, once a day. Amazing to see that too. Okay. And how do you like to use trails? So we've talked a little bit about the frequency or how often, but if you could rank these different opportunities, how do you currently like to use them in terms of your preferred experience and your preferred contribution or in terms of involvement? Excellent, thank you. This is probably the most intensive question that we have out of all of them. I promise they will get easier in terms of the level of thought behind them to some extent, or at least contribution. Excellent. And I'll give it a couple more seconds because I know it takes a little bit more time to finish this question. Good opportunity to have a sip of tea. Wonderful. And we know that there are a lot of other different ways to experience these trails as well. So this is really just more in generalities. And again, based on your general or most frequent use, knowing that things change and we like to have different experiences. We'll also talk a little bit about that during the presentation.
1 second. I can't.
Okay. Getting close to that magic number I'm seeing. So that is great. Okay. Can wait a little minute more, not a minute, but a couple seconds more, just in case we get to that 16. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. Oh, no, they're coming in. I knew I was waiting for one more. So thank you so much. And do you currently have a favorite trail, either by name or location, in the city right now? Is there one that comes to mind in terms of your absolute favorite trail to go on to and to use and to experience as it stands right now? Excellent. And if you can name it, that would be great. Or, yeah, the closest location or area that you can think of to describe it. You know, some aren't necessarily formalized trails right now, which is something that we'll be talking a little bit about later. Wonderful. Some frequent responses, which are not surprising to see. So wonderful there, and others that I'm sure we'll need to do even more exploring of as we continue to work through this process. Wonderful. Okay. Seeing more coming. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for all of these great answers. Okay. And when you think of trails in the city right now, currently, when you think of the experience, when you think of how you feel on them, how you interact with them, what words come to mind for you? I don't think we've put a cap on how many words you can include, so please feel free to put as many as you would like. But when you just think of that experience and think of what you currently feel when you're using them. Wonderful, thank you. Energizing, I like that word. I don't know why that one popped out for me specifically, but I like that. Wonderful. And these are always so fun to see because they take words that are more frequently used and bring them together, but also show some unique ones as well. Wonderful. And these are always so fun to put in future presentations and reports and whatnot. So great to see so many responses coming through. This is excellent. Okay. Getting close to the end of the questions, I promise. I'll give that another moment, just in case other inputs come through. Okay, great. And how do you think trails could be improved? And we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But as you're coming into this session, you're obviously quite interested and passionate, or have something on your mind maybe that you want to make sure is conveyed or communicated through this process. And so how could we improve what we're doing when it comes to trails from the city's perspective? And what could we be doing? Are there specific areas? Are there types of designs that you've seen? Again, not meant to be spending too much time on this. There'll be lots of different opportunities to talk about it, but sort of your initial gut thought or reaction around things that would be really wonderful to see improved in the city of Kawartha Lakes when it comes to trails. Excellent, thank you very much. Excellent. And seeing some messages around maintenance, connectivity, user consideration relative to design, some considerations around specific link improvements, looking at how we can enhance maybe some of those amenities to make it more enjoyable or supportive along your experience. Very helpful comments. Thank you. Inputs. Excellent. Okay, great. And do you have any other questions that you would like us to address through this process, knowing that we'll have the presentation and another opportunity at the end of the presentation for discussion? But are there any questions that you were hoping that were going to be answered through tonight's session? And Gilly, I see your hand up. Yes.
I just wanted to alert you, Tanya posed a question in the chat, and I
Yes.
had suggested that we would hold it for now and come back to it. So I just want to make sure that that gets logged in our flagged for you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Gillian. Do you think that that's a question that we should answer now, or do you think that's something that would be better answered towards maybe a certain part of the presentation or the end of the discussion?
Maybe we can come back to it. It's related to ATV use on trails and timing.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Sandy, I see your hand up. Oh, sorry, you're muted. Does that help? We also will have lots of opportunities throughout the discussion to have questions. And of course, there are a lot of different slides. So I would encourage us to put them up either here or in the chat and maybe wait to see what the presentation holds in terms of content. They may answer those questions for you. If not, we will absolutely take a pause throughout the presentation to make sure that we answer those as we go through them. Because I am seeing a couple of hands up, just wanted to let people know we are not taking the questions. We just wanted to let you know. Seeing some other ones on here, perfect. And we'll log those through the process. Gilly, if you maybe wouldn't mind just writing this one down that we have on here so that we can come back to it. We will definitely speak to that throughout the process and the presentation. Okay, so those were all of our questions. Thank you so much for answering them. We really appreciate it. It does give us quite a bit of a better sense of where everybody's coming from and helps us to build out some of that information. I see there's always been already been some great conversation in the chat and some commentary. So it looks like everybody's relatively used to using that. I'm going to share my screen with the presentation so that we can get started and we can start to get through quite a bit of information that we are hoping to share with you tonight and provide that much more context on the project that we're working on and what we've been doing over the past couple of months. So in terms of the purpose of today's session, I won't get into too many more details again because we have talked about it, but the purpose is really to close the loop with members of the public and stakeholders to make sure that you know what we've been doing in the first phase of our work so that you have an understanding of the intent and purpose of this project, of what we've been doing, what we hope to achieve through this process, and take a look at what some of those initial outcomes are. I can say that at this point, we do not have specific recommendations that we are putting forward as part of this presentation. This is really focusing more so on the background and the context around trails, what we've heard, what we've assessed, and how we plan to move forward in order to create those recommendations moving through the next phases of the project. We have scheduled our session until 8:30 tonight, and I promise I will try my best not to keep you any longer. Sometimes discussion leads us a little bit beyond 8:30, but we will make sure to let you know if that's the case. And if you do need to leave at any point in time, not a problem at all. This is being recorded and will be put up on the jump-in page, so you're welcome to come back and listen to the information again or hear anything that you've missed if you have to do so going forward. In terms of general housekeeping, we've already gone through the Menti exercise, so that's a great start already. Everybody seems to be muted, using the chat, raising your hand. functioning within the Zoom parameters as best we can. So thank you very much for that. And we continue to encourage you to do that as we work through the presentation as much as possible. So if you do have a question that you would like answered, I'd first suggest you maybe type that into the chat. Gilly's going to be monitoring that, and she will let me know what's coming up and if it's something that we can address through some of our slides. And if you would prefer to just raise your hand and ask the question in response to what you've heard or what we're going through and ask it to the group, we're also happy to do that as well. So those are just a couple of the housekeeping items for today's session or this evening's session. In terms of what we're going to be talking about and the presentation that we have for you this evening, we are going to be first talking more about our general project process and the foundations behind the development of the Trails Master Plan update.
Hello.
We're going to be summarizing what we've heard so far in terms of our online engagement and some of the other engagement activities that we've been doing to build out a bit more of an understanding of the current use of trails and desires for the future of trails. We're then going to have a conversation about what trails currently look like within the city and how we're planning to work with city staff and stakeholders to explore building out the trail system, refining it, and designing a network of trails for the city of Kawartha Lakes that really aims to stand the test of time and looks forward in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. This is an update to the original Trails Master Plan, and we'll speak quite a bit to that. So we know that we're not starting from scratch, and a lot of that presentation or this presentation speaks to that as we go through the different content. So without further ado, in terms of our project timeline, Jen had mentioned that we started the project a little bit earlier this year in the summer and have worked through our first phase of the project, that foundational component of an understanding of the background, the existing conditions, the existing supports, and what we're starting from. And we are using engagement very much as we can as a way to inform our technical work, but then also to confirm what we are moving forward with ultimately. And it's a bit of a cyclical approach where we're hoping to gather information through sessions like this and then report back to make sure that what we heard was accurate or in line with what you were hoping from an input perspective. So this is the final engagement activity of our first phase of work, and we'll be documenting all of the process and the outcomes and the input and reporting that and sharing that back out publicly. And then we'll be moving on to our next technical phases with the aim of wrapping everything up by, it says March, but probably spring of next year would be more general, just in terms of timeline and targets for completion. And I mentioned this before, but I will say it again, that we know we are not reinventing the wheel here. We know that we are not starting from scratch. This is an update to the original Trails Master Plan that was done in 2006. Now, quite a bit of time has elapsed since that first plan was done, and a lot has changed, not just within the city context, but also when it comes to how we look at trails, who uses them, how we use them, different practices for maintenance and management, funding opportunities have emerged. And so while we're not starting from scratch, it has been quite a few years since that original plan. And what we want to make sure that we do is that we respectfully bring in components of that plan that still ring true, that we want to maintain. We also want to take a critical look at maybe some sections or pieces that need to be adapted to reflect new practices or new content or new pieces that are now applicable in this time frame and when we're developing the plan, where we want to build in some new best or comparable practices where we know maybe something hasn't quite worked and we want to try something new. And there also is some new content that we want to make sure that we build into this plan ultimately to help make sure that the update Trails Master Plan is a tool, is a guide, is something that city staff and stakeholders can use to move trails forward over the long term. And I had mentioned a couple of different year horizons. This isn't change in 2 years. This is change in 5, 10 plus years is the goal. And we know that that time will be critical. So respecting the original plan, but acknowledging that time has elapsed and that there are some components that we are going to be revisiting. And we know from the input that we've received so far that there are those opportunities, and there are also opportunities to continue to maintain and build out what was already in the original plan. And we wanted to get a little bit more insight into that by asking community members and stakeholders first, what their experiences are, whether or not they'd seen or participated in the original plan, and what the general feelings are around trails. And that was the launch of our Jump In Page online survey and interactive mapping tool. And we've received just shy of 250 responses, which has been excellent. It's been slowly ticking up as we've been promoting through communications over the past couple of weeks. And it's been a great opportunity to check in and just to see the different sentiments and the different feelings and experiences around trails within the city. We're excited to see that there's some good representation from all over the city in terms of participation, different communities in different areas. Most are currently permanent residents, but we hope through some of the other rounds of engagement that we're going to also be reaching out to some of the other seasonal residents too, and have more of a breakdown of that particular profile. We also got some great input on what worked well and what maybe we could improve upon when it comes to the 2006 plan. And it's been really helpful to see some of those comments because we know that there's varying opinions and interests around that. So while some individuals or respondents feel like there's positives about the plan, we know that there are also opportunities for improvement. So there are some well-maintained sections of the trail right now, but there are definitely some other sections of the trail that require more direction on maintenance practices and more refinement on that. There was some acknowledgement of an attempt to have a range of users and uses in terms of being accommodated on trails, but other comments that acknowledged that there could be more direction and more clarity around what that looks like from a design and enforcement perspective. The communications side of things and the promotion side of things was something that was definitely highlighted in terms of an opportunity for improvement. So some comments that the awareness wasn't as great in terms of the original plan, but some acknowledgement as well that there were some great efforts to try and build a really strong stakeholder base of involvement, which was excellent to see. So again, it's just an interesting, really varied amount of input that we got, and this is only a snapshot of the comments that we received. And definitely some great acknowledgement to the successes, but some opportunities for improvement as well. Thinking of a bit of the profile of users and uses of the trails currently, we know that through these responses, and I acknowledge that this is a voluntary survey, so this is not statistically valid, but again, it's nice to see those responses and to see how they're changing over time. The frequency of use similar to what we had seen through the very brief survey we had today. Pretty high frequency of use, either daily or several times a week, which is excellent to see in terms of the interest and the enthusiasm. Most people are getting there by either walking, driving, or biking, not uncommon. The distance and the geography is very wide within the city. So we know that sometimes it takes a bit of time to get to the trails that you want or need to get to, but there's also some local opportunities too. There's also a great range of users and uses, all the way from active modes to other motorized uses as well. And that speaks volumes to the opportunities that are available from an experience perspective. Really interesting to note is how information is gathered or used to get to those trails. And this probably goes back to one of the comments about opportunities to improve around communication. These trails, these wonderful trail systems that are available are definitely quite ingrained in the community and something that people know to use, but there could be some opportunities to highlight more knowledge and more awareness of where those trails are. And last but certainly not least, the barriers and future visions, a nice juxtaposition there. So some of the barriers, as we've received comments, they've kind of been the same 5 over the course of the past couple of weeks, but they've had different rankings. So kind of changing in that range, but usually the same in terms of weather, safety, accessibility, time, and lack of amenities. But for the future vision, it also reflects well on what some of the barriers are. So even though a barrier is accessibility, the vision is to make them more accessible. So again, really liking to see that more proactive look at taking some of those barriers and thinking of them more as an opportunity for improvement as much as possible. The other activity that we had was a interactive mapping tool, and that let people drop pins onto a map. And we took that map and we also added comments that we received just written into the email address or also highlighted to us from a team perspective. And so we know some of those locations where there's need for improvement, where there's gaps in the system, where there are opportunities for new trails. And that gives us a really great picture of how the system is functioning right now and how we can look to possibly improve those. So while there were 64 pins dropped on the map, what we have in terms of a knowledge of specific areas of improvement is then further enhanced by any written in comments that we've received. And thank you so much for all of those that we have, as well as any previous submissions that we've had through the city on potential upgrades or recommendations throughout the city and on the trail system. So that is what we've heard, and what we're aiming to do through this first phase of work and using the input that we've received and a lot of the great conversations that we've had is to revisit the original vision and objectives. So what we have on the screen right now is the original vision. The middle are the original objectives, and there were 23 recommendations in that 2006 Trails Master Plan. And so as we gather this input and as we start to sift through all of the great information that we've received and the background that we've been undertaking, you'll probably see that at the end of this phase, there may be some tweaks to the vision statement. There may be some refinements or additions to the objectives, and we'll definitely start working along the lines of the recommendations to make sure that we're vetting to ensure that they still ring true to this process. So I put them up again just to let you know again that we're not starting from scratch. We are building on this, but that there likely will be some changes to what you had originally seen in the 2006 plan, just to make sure that it truly reflects the input that we're gathering and what we're hearing from the community and stakeholders through this process almost 15 plus years later. And when it comes to the Trails Master Plan update, what we're really wanting to have a conversation around is what we're talking about and what we're calling recreational mobility. And recreational mobility is not necessarily a brand new thing, but mobility is typically used as a word we find when it comes to more day-to-day transportation. But it really does have an application when it comes to recreation. So fun, fitness, social, any of those aspects. But it does have a much more nuanced conversation and a much more in-depth conversation that is impacted by a lot of different factors and features. And so when we think of recreational mobility in the city of Kawartha Lakes, we have to think of a number of different things. We have to think about what's causing people to want to go to and from these different trails and use them, how we're supporting people and enabling people to be able to get to the trails and use them, how we are trying to mitigate or reduce conflict and risk between different users, whether or not the actual trails themselves are accessible and people are able to get to them and use them in an accessible way, that there are barriers that are removed or there are design solutions to barriers to try to encourage use, and that we are looking to the places where there is greatest demand and greatest interest from a use existing, but also future use perspective. And the goal is really to try to improve and enhance and encourage more recreational mobility. Because right now, it just so happens that people want to use trails more than ever, which is amazing. A lot has happened in the past 2 years, and trails seem to be just that wonderful opportunity and experience for people to get involved and to be active and be social in these odd times that we continue to live in. There's funding, there's support at all levels that says trails are an exceptional way to invest in the community for all different uses and users. And that is really what the commitment is here, as much as possible, to be able to leverage that in the context of the city of Kawartha Lakes. And when we think of those different components, especially within the city, we know that that brings up a lot of different conversations and a lot of different needs for consideration. And one of those biggest consideration points are the different users and the uses and their needs. And what we really wanted to emphasize here is that we acknowledge and that we also are aiming to understand and really delve into the considerations around different users, and that there are so many different influencing factors around how and why people use trails. There's different influences from a seasonal, from an experience, from a comfort and safety perspective that is very individual to each person. And so while we're aiming to design trails for a specific type of different users, we also understand that not everybody is the same. I ride my bike. I also, walk. I also have used a scooter or rollerblades here and there, and have tried other different seasonal forms of mobility and recreational use as well. So we're not necessarily always the same user all the time. And so it is a really important conversation to have, but it is also a very multifaceted conversation. And so we're working and aiming to really dig into that in the context of the city and what that looks like from a route and design and next steps perspective. And so similarly, when we think about then the different types of users, we know that there are some more consistently applied categories or user groups, if you will. And I know it probably isn't enough time to read the details of all of the contents of this slide, so the slides will obviously be put up after. But I think the real point that we're trying to drive home here is that designing the ideal trail that accommodates everybody may not be possible, just considering where trails are. In wonderful natural areas, forested areas, along waterways. And we don't always have the abundance of space that we would want to accommodate everybody in that safe and comfortable way. And so we acknowledge that through this process, we have to be very strategic about who we're accommodating and where, and how the design is helping to create those experiences that are desired. And these are just some of the design considerations, just some that we work through and that we use as a guidance point for that, as well as the input that we've been gathering over the course of the past couple of months and as we go forward. So users at the forefront as much as possible, with an acknowledgement that it is really a challenge, but also an opportunity to think of everybody and to design for everybody in all locations. And so we have to be open-minded as to how we're planning to do that and where we're planning to do that throughout the city. And I've talked a lot about design, and I've talked a lot about the different considerations behind it. So maybe I'll just take a quick pause because I'm seeing some numbers tick up in the chat, and maybe some hands going up. So Gilly, maybe I'll just turn it over to you. Are there any questions that we could easily answer now, build in? Great.
Yeah, sure. You can see the chat. It's visible to you. I want to bring you down to a comment from David Hodgson.
Thank you.
And if you wouldn't mind just having a read through that. David has a concern with trail maintenance in the Somerville tracks and the BRTC. He's concerned about fire safety and access. And he was just wondering if we were going to be specifically covering those aspects in tonight's presentation. I let David know that we wouldn't specifically be talking about maintenance per se. We appreciate that comment back, his concern. And Claire, maybe you just want to talk about a little bit about what we'll be presenting in terms of next steps and how we'll be incorporating this feedback into our next steps. And that is part of the presentation. I know you don't want to jump ahead, but just give him a sense of that.
No, great question and great point to stop there to talk about it. So you're absolutely right, Gilly. We're not going to be speaking to specific maintenance practices through this particular presentation. That will definitely be something that we'll be addressing through the next presentation. So David, if you do feel like you need to head out, not a problem at all. We have received the written comments about those specific maintenance concerns within the Somerville tract specifically, and we've been made aware of those. Maintenance when it comes to trails, agree that there's a conversation about fire safety, emergency access, also seasonal maintenance considerations, and year-round maintenance too. So we will be speaking to that through this process, and there will be recommendations at the end of the day in the Trails Master Plan update about trail maintenance and considerations, but not specifically at tonight's session, if that was what you were looking for. And I won't be offended if you head out, not a problem at all.
Thanks, David, for that. And Claire, just one more I want to alert you to. There are a couple of other comments as well, but maybe we'll park those ones till the end. Okay, John has asked, is the proximity of trails to settlement areas part of the design criteria? With climate change top of mind, it would be counterintuitive to be encouraging people to drive to trails to walk in nature. Ensuring that each community has access to at least one good trail system, preferably with connectivity to a larger network if they want to go further, would be ideal.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for going through that, Gilly. And John, you've hit on a couple of really great points about a network, and we'll be getting into some of the approaches around the network in the next couple of slides. But when it comes to design criteria, I would say access and direct connectivity to the major built up areas, as well as key destinations, are a key consideration of that criteria. Also, that point about how people are getting to the trails is not lost on us, that using a car is up there with walking and cycling to the trail. Now, we know that for some users that may need to happen, or for accessibility purposes that may need to happen, but we definitely aren't in the interest of encouraging everybody to drive to trails. So where we can provide connectivity as much as possible to get people there through active modes, we are definitely going to be looking at that. Probably a really appropriate first time to mention about the alignment and the overlapping of two concurrent plans that the city is undertaking, the Trails Master Plan update that we're talking about tonight, as well as the Active Transportation Master Plan that's going to be launched in the coming months. And that really is the great opportunity, having those plans done together, but also as two separate assignments, to focus on recreational mobility through this particular project and more off-road experiences when it comes to trails and recreational pursuits, but also to link those opportunities with active transportation routes and facilities that create that connectivity as much as possible within the built up areas and between them too. So it just so happens that myself and my colleagues are working on both plans with the city, which will provide some great continuity and connectivity, pardon the pun again. But that really is an intentional difference between the two for areas of focus, but also a great opportunity to leverage the two from a connectivity perspective.
And one more, actually, I'm just going
Yes.
to throw it in because it is kind of related to trail assumptions and the list of things on here. So Tanya asks, I don't know if it's pertinent to this evening's presentation or not, so I'll leave it to you to decide. I'm new to Lindsay and wondering why ATVs aren't allowed on the trails 12 months a year. So maybe a little bit overlaps with some of the trail assumptions, user needs, design, and whatnot.
And
If it's possible to answer tonight.
Yeah, and thanks, Gilly, for that. And I think that that is probably one of the reasons why I spent quite a bit of time on the user considerations, because what we are still working through when working with city staff and stakeholders to understand is what the current permitted uses are and restricted uses are, the timelines for those, and what that looks like in the grander scheme of trails. So I can't necessarily personally give you the history as to why ATVs aren't allowed on the trails 12 months a year, but I know that there's been a lot of past work done and past conversations that have occurred about the appropriate use of certain trails relative to different users, where that occurs, and the timing. Jen, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wasn't sure if that was something that the city wanted to maybe weigh in on a little bit.
Yeah, I think that certainly we can review it as part of this process. When the original or when the most recent bylaw was completed, we did work with the local ATV association to determine the best timing for access for ATVs. And it was decided at that point that that would be from the 1st of May until the end of November. In fact, during the month of April, there's no motorized use on the trail. So it gives staff an opportunity to do some maintenance work and to do some repairs and things like that during that month. But certainly something that we can review if there's a need and if it makes sense from a maintenance perspective to adjust that, then we can certainly consider that.
Thanks very much, Jen. And I will acknowledge, because I saw in the chat a response and a thanks from John and the reference to the Healthy Environment Plan. We do have that and have been reviewing that as well. So understand the very strong connection between trails and climate impacts and general environmental impacts. When we think of criteria, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, the balance of what's possible, environmental impacts, experience, accessibility, I'm sure you can appreciate is all part of a lot of different aspects and considerations. And this is very helpful to understand what are considered priorities for community members and stakeholders, and something that we can start to build into not only the criteria development, but also in how we prioritize different initiatives going forward as well. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for using the chat as well. It's really helpful to have that record, and we will keep that along with this, this video and this recording too. So we're at about slide 14 of 31. So I will press on in the interest of time, but please continue to use the chat or raise your hand. This has been really helpful. But we've started to very nicely segue into the considerations around the trails network itself. And maybe because this slide has been up for a little while now, you may have a sense of just some of the different assumptions or givens, as I call them, about how we're approaching the Trails Network review and the approach to the Trails Master Plan update. And so you'll see that we know there are already existing and previously planned trails that are out there right now. And we have, and we'll show them on the screen, map those so that we have an understanding of that foundation. We also know that all of those routes are found all throughout the city. So there are routes that have been identified in specific built-up areas, all throughout the rural areas, through specific areas in terms of natural and cultural areas and destinations. So we've already got a really great foundation of routing already in place right now. But that doesn't mean that we are accepting all of those routes as is. In fact, quite a few of them do have to be revisited, just considering the timeline when it was developed back in 2006 and the timing of some of those other initiatives as well. So again, like that first statement says, we will be reviewing and looking at which of those routes we can bring forward, but also some that may not continue as part of this process. We are aiming to integrate, and we'll have another slide about this, with the ATMP process so that there is clarity around this plan tackling the off-road recommendations and the ATMP tackling more of the on-road and boulevard recommendations. Destinations, and these are physical specific destinations, but also areas where we want to see a commitment to having, John, to your point, direct access of trails to those major destinations as much as possible, so that we're either getting to the front door or very close to it and have a common experience to get there. Focusing on user needs and design as much as possible with an emphasis on comfort and safety, and having consistency of design so that there's predictability in experience as much as possible. And last but certainly not least, we are tackling things that are within the city's purview and that the city has control over. So we know that there are a lot of other pieces at play, that there are some provincial and interregional routes that are available. Those are spine systems that are important to the network, but we want to make sure that we're identifying aspects and plan elements and recommendations that really can be something that the city can tackle and something that the city has control over, while also strategically partnering with others. So these are just some of the really important aspects and givens that, that we want to make sure are kind of in the back of our mind as we go through this process, and continue to be hopefully in the back of your mind as you read the rest of the slides or hear what I'm saying. So as we revisit the network and we start to think about what a trails network could look like in the city of Kawartha Lakes, we work through an iterative process that builds on that foundation of what has been developed and what has been identified previously. And we start by looking at what's on the ground now. And we start by looking at the trails that exist and assessing those trails. So we have done a desktop review and taken all of the comments that we received so far to start to build out a database of what exists there now and what the conditions look like. And in the next couple of weeks, we will also be going out and we'll be investigating those in even more detail from an existing perspective and a future opportunity perspective. But this really gives us a sense of what is, as I said before, on the ground now and what is currently identified and being used as a trail now within the city. And that gives us a great foundation of understanding of what is there currently. And then we build in what has been previously identified or previously proposed. And this adds to that network or that system even more so. So we built in some of the previously recommended routes from the 2006 plan, the Lindsay Continuity Plan, the Bob Cajun AT Plan, touring routes from Tourism Kawartha, and many others that have been either adopted or suggested through different processes. You'll recall in the assumptions that we may not be necessarily accepting all of these, but we want to make sure that we acknowledge them and we respectfully go through the process to determine whether or not they still fit in the context of trails in the city of Kawartha Lakes. And this gives us a really interesting picture. And apologies, I know you can't see everything on this screen, so we will be uploading the maps so that you can delve deeper into them. A really interesting and full system of potential trails and existing trails, as well as complementary systems that could make up this trails network. The solid lines are existing trails that are currently on the ground now, as well as dotted lines or dashed lines that are previously proposed trails. We also have on-road connecting links that had been identified through some of the previous plans or some of the previous processes. You may recall me saying this is really off-road focused in terms of our trails plan update. We are focusing on the off-road opportunities. We know that connectivity will only really be achieved through some of the on-road linkages, but that will mostly be covered through the ATMP and through some strategic signage and wayfinding as part of the Trails Master Plan update. So it's a lot to start working through, and we at least now have a strong understanding of where those routes are and where they currently are in terms of roadways or off-road pathways, and allows us to start to work through that process of determining whether or not they're going to be moving forward as we refine the network. And that was a citywide picture, but we also have zoom-ins and mapping of the different areas, of built-up areas, I should say, because we know we want to focus on leveraging those opportunities within the communities as much as possible, and highlighting where we can enhance that connectivity, enhance the access and the recreational mobility opportunity. And building in on that, we then continue to build out the picture of what has been previously considered and what we can continue to consider going forward. But that is just the existing and previously proposed system. As we move forward, we also know that there could be other opportunities that maybe weren't explored through the previous plan or through some other initiatives. And so we do want to look strategically at some new trail opportunities in other locations throughout the city. And that has to be framed and shaped in different ways. And it's something that we've been working through over the past couple of weeks to really hone in on exactly how we want to focus these efforts. And when we're looking at new trails, there's a couple of different opportunities and considerations that we want to make sure that we build out. The first are the corridors, so the locations or the sites where the trails could exist. The second are the different features, so what happens along that trail. Then the start and end points, so where people access or exit trails, how wayfinding and signage can connect trail systems, and last but not least, that integration with wider active transportation initiatives. So over the next couple of slides, we're just going to go into a little bit of detail of how we plan to approach that. So from a graphic perspective, when we consider new trails, those first three features that I spoke to are illustrated here. The actual corridor itself, so where we see a trail occurring and what that space looks like. The features, which could be barriers or opportunities, depending on how you see them. And then the start and end points, which are typically looking like trailheads or entry and exit points in some defined way. And when we're looking at new opportunities or new areas to explore, those corridors that we could be looking at, or those sites that we could be looking at, could include provincial parks and forest tracts, because we know that there's demand and interest in having trails with natural and cultural areas of experience as much as possible. Some high demand locations where there's goat paths that we know that trails are being used, but they're not formally identified as such. New development areas where there's planned build outs and trails could be part of those new designs. Parks and open spaces where we have publicly owned lands that could be used for active and passive recreation. Waterways as a great view and vista, also a draw where we can see some great linear opportunities, and possibly some unopened road allowances and hydro corridors. And what we've started to do is map some of those locations within the city so that we can identify those opportunities and see where they currently are and how they fit into the existing and previously planned systems that we already have mapped. Along those sites and within those corridors, there could also be some of those features that require some unique design solutions. So as you continue along a trail, there could be major roads that need to be crossed. There could be waterways. There could be natural areas with environmentally significant features that we need to make sure that we reduce impact on. There could be some changes in topography that have an impact on accessibility or the experience there in terms of the overall surface and how we accommodate how people use that space. So it's not just about that point A to point B, but it's about what's happening along it and what that site looks like too, and how we can design for that. And speaking of the start and end points, we know that trailheads has come up as a really important topic of conversation. So how we are identifying them and how we're designing them. And when we think of those start and end points, you know, what along those trails could be a major trailhead, what could be a minor trailhead, something that has more features and more amenities built into the design, maybe something that's a little bit more low key or something that has a bit less design, but still identifies the transition. We also know that in some locations, depending on the use or the expected use, that we may need to see some access barriers. Either they exist or need to be built in. So whether or not that's seasonal or restricted access for certain uses or just slowing down, those are some of the considerations that may be at those start and end points. And parking seems to have come up quite a bit throughout the process as well. Who's parking and how we're accommodating that parking is something that we know we want to try to tackle at both existing and planned locations as well as new locations too. And then there's the next component of the consideration, which is, so you have a trail and a location, whether it's a park or it's in an open space or forest tract, but how do you get in between them? How do you get from one trail to another? And that connectivity is not lost on us either. Connectivity, it can be quite challenging to achieve in a trails network just because of the nature of trails, no pun intended there. But we want to be able to try to get people to and from those trail opportunities as much as possible. So the thinking behind that approach is that we want to work with city staff and stakeholders to develop a robust signage and wayfinding strategy that acknowledges where trails exist and how to get there, and also identifies some branding loop opportunities to really promote and encourage use. And that's also where the AT integration comes into play, or active transportation master plan integration comes into play, because that's where we're really hoping to see some cross-pollination or alignment there, where we see opportunities to improve along some of those corridors as part of the active transportation master plan. And so for the signage and wayfinding, we'll be considering different sign types, what the loop routes could look like, from a distance or user group or destination perspective, and then what the branding could look like too, something more tailored, something more unique to the city, something that is specific to the different trails and the experiences that we're looking for. But it really is a great awareness and educational opportunity, but also a tourism and economic driver opportunity as well. So a great way to achieve the connectivity, but also promote greater use and encourage greater use as much as possible. And from an active transportation integration perspective, if I haven't said it enough over the course of the past couple of slides, in terms of the specific ways that we're going to be tackling these different components through the two plans, the Trails Plan update, as I said before, is really focusing on the off-road connections and accommodating active and motorized users where it's appropriate, building in the accessibility standards, as well as developing some guidance that is specific to the city. From an active transportation perspective, the focus is more on the on-road facilities and in boulevard facilities for that particular master plan. And there are other design guidelines and standards that we want to and need to adhere to through that process. But the overlap is that both of them together really are intending to encourage and promote and enhance recreation and transportation mobility throughout the overall process. And that is really important. And we hope that we'll be able to see, and we're aiming to be able to identify where the networks will be able to connect, where we will be able to highlight priorities that are complementary to both plans, have that continuity of design so the experience is quite similar, and be able to leverage the signage and wayfinding and branding to be able to connect and promote and encourage use all throughout the city as much as possible. So over the course of the past maybe 10 or so slides, we walked through a number of different pieces. What we've assessed in terms of the existing and previously planned routes. We know that there are existing routes that require improvement. We know that there are existing routes where the uses aren't necessarily complementary, and we need to come up with solutions for those specific locations. We know that there are previously planned routes that probably don't fit in the context of the trails update at this point. Thinking specifically of a lot of the on-road connections that were in the 2006 plan, and some that just probably aren't feasible. But we want to work through this process of assessing what the existing looks like, what the previously proposed looks like, and also highlighting new opportunities that leverage these great off-road natural features to be able to build out a more robust trails network that's connected by active transportation corridors and linkages, which just happens to be addressed through a plan that's happening at the same time. So I know that was a lot of information. I see one or two comments that have come through, and also happy to open it up for any questions or comments that you may have if you just want to raise your hand or add them into the chat. Again, we're not having any recommendations here right now. These are really the early stages. So please share anything and everything that you would like or would like to contribute through this process. We're open ears, absolutely. Gilly, is there anything in the chat? Sorry, I find it odd to open it up.
Kelsey and John just added a question. So they said that they had heard that they should participate in the meeting to be able to voice their concerns about motor vehicles that are using the trails, that are running stop signs, crossing over roadways, belligerent behavior to pedestrians. And is this something being covered or addressed at any point?
So I hope that some of my last comments address that actually. No recommendations are set right now, of course, but that is why we have spent quite a bit of time talking about our understanding of different users. That is why I wanted to really reinforce the fact that we're not just accepting existing trails as is, that we are looking to identify design enhancements, possible directions on restricted use or permitted use, signage and etiquette information, also enforcement considerations and maintenance considerations too. So we have heard, really appreciate the comment, Kelsey and John. We have heard that comment come through in a number of different locations throughout the city. We have identified those locations, and those are actually going to be part of the field investigation that we're going to be going through going forward, so that we can better understand ourselves what's happening in those spaces and how we can try to address those concerns. I'm sure you can appreciate that there are always two sides to the conversation, and we're trying our best as much as possible to hear all of those perspectives and to weight and balance those perspectives too, while also keeping the safety and comfort of all users at the forefront as much as possible.
Claire, I might just jump in a little bit there too. I think
Thanks.
that I know the area that Kelsey and John are speaking about, and that would be also addressed through some trailhead standards that we would look at during this process, because I know that they're not just specifically talking about motorized use along the trail, although that is part of it. It's also kind of parking while at a trailhead and things like that. So certainly something that I'm glad that the comment was raised. It's something that we can add to kind of the list of items that we will be reviewing, and take that into consideration when we're looking at some trailhead standards and designs.
Great add in there, Jen. Thanks very much. That's probably why we put in a bit more detail around the trailheads, to break it down to those different components, because sometimes trailheads and the design of trailheads, they get oversimplified, I think I would say, if I'm being judgmental of our own practice. It's the signs that get put there, and is there parking, yes or no? Here, that conversation we know does need to go a bit further. What is being accommodated when it comes to parking? What are the crossing treatments that need to happen to get all of the different users from point A to point B? What is the signage and enforcement there? I don't need to go through all of those different features, but we know that there needs to be consideration and also direction, Jen, to your point, on standards and guidance on how to address those locations. We've actually been alerted to a couple of those different locations and major corridors where crossing is a big concern. So we've identified those and are actively trying to come up with something more standardized, but also some of those site-specific improvements, if I could say that too, of where we could see some benefit.
Yeah, thank you for catching that, Jen. I didn't quite make it down to the issue about the parking and the blocking of access roads, and I know Kelsey and John had logged that comment earlier in the discussion as well. So thanks for catching that.
Yeah, go right
Alan
ahead, Peter.
has a question.
Oh, sorry, Peter.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just noticed earlier as well, and there was a question in the chat about please identify the appropriate time to address specific routes and access points. So maybe you want to guide people where they can find the maps and how they can provide recommendations. That was from Palfi a bit early on.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's great. So we knew that we wouldn't have all the time in the world tonight to be able to go through all of the maps, and that people may want to take the time to go through them and to comment on them. So there'll be a couple of different ways that we hope you'll be able to do that. The first is through the jump in page, through the interactive mapping. And if you haven't used that already, it's a drop pin. So you can drop pins in locations where there are routes that you think need to be improved, new routes that should be explored, maybe areas of conflict or crossing concerns or barriers concerns. So if you feel comfortable using that tool, that is still open and something that we can use. We'll also be uploading these maps in PDF form. So if you're able to download those and mark them up electronically, please feel free to send them to any one of the team members that's listed on the page. We also have our Kawartha Trails update at CIMA.ca. I'll just type that into the chat now. That can be used. I think that's on the page, but just reinforcing it a little bit more. And if you would prefer to provide in written comments about specific locations or markup maps that you've done, or we've even received Strava routes or all trails routes, you're welcome to do that too. We encourage kind of any format. So I think that there should be a couple of different opportunities, hopefully, that are provided. If none of those really work for you, please feel free to reach out to one of the team members and we can find another way to get that information to us. I saw a comment in when I was able to actually finally pull up the chat from Alan. Hey, Alan, about defining the users. So very succinct and straightforward question, easy to respond. Active transportation plan is yes, purely for self-propelled and accessible modes of transportation and not for motorized users. So yes, absolutely correct there. Hence the active transportation master plan, whereas trails does speak to all of the range of users that could or are using trails right now. Thanks for the clarification or the prompt to clarify. Excellent. So I can promise you that the next time you hear from us at a public event, or if you're part of any other stakeholder activities or online engagement, you will start to see more recommendations and more preliminary ideas around potential routes, around potential design considerations, around potential guidance. And that covers, as I said before, the existing, the previously proposed, and any of the other potential trails. I just saw one come through from Peter. Thank you very much. I hope I'm not rushing reading this, but no mention of the Ganaraska hiking trail. And so we have in our mapping a number of different layers that are incorporated into our trails layer, if you will, in the mapping. And so we have in the background all of that knowledge of what the different components are and what the different pieces are, and have that in more of a what we would put from a signage and branding perspective. Right now, we're focusing a little bit more on the alignment and the location, and then we'll be bringing out the naming of it. But as always, if there's any missing trails that you think have not been reflected in the mapping, that could be something that might not have been in the database that was available, or something that we just haven't seen yet. We definitely welcome those trails and adding those to the mapping. We know that there are some really exceptional existing trail systems. You've put those in, Peter, the Trans-Canada Trail, the Ganaraska, the Victoria Rail Trail, and others, really significant connections that will continue to be acknowledged through the process for sure. I'm sorry for my sniffles too. So in terms of, we've already had a couple of questions and we'll continue to look at this. In terms of next steps, I know this can sometimes be a bit overwhelming or frustrating to just hear a lot of information looking into this presentation. And when you don't see kind of firm recommendations, know that sometimes feels like there isn't a lot to really sink your teeth into, but we really wanted to make sure that we bring everybody along this process with us, that you're part of the conversation and that you're understanding how we're working through the process and what we're doing and what we're building into this update as much as possible. And so what we're going to be doing after this meeting is taking all of the comments, not just from this meeting, but from an agency meeting that we had, a stakeholder meeting that we had, some wonderful pieces of input that we've received, both hard copy and electronically, from great stakeholders who've taken the time to provide their input, and we're so appreciative of that. And we'll be consolidating that into a summary report of everything that we've done in this first phase of work, and hopefully releasing that out so that you can take a look at what we've done and what we've heard to confirm that, and then moving forward with really sink our teeth, as I said before, into the network and what that looks like from an improvements perspective to existing trails, refining the previously proposed trails, building out new trails, and coming up with some very tailored and specific to Kawartha design guidance that we can use going forward from a trails perspective. I think I saw, I'm sorry, I closed down the chat again, Gilly. I think I saw another comment come through. I don't want to miss it, just in case there was a question.
Yep. Is there somewhere to find a detailed list of ATV trails in the Kawartha area?
Great.
Tanya.
So I'll start, and then maybe Jen, I'll pass it over to you if there's more information. So the first things that come to mind, the maps that we have do indicate some of the off-road vehicle routes that have been identified through the Off-Road Vehicle Task Force and other past works. Also, I think reaching out to the ATV Club and any of their groups that could share that information would probably have the most up-to-date information on exactly where they're promoting and highlighting those routes as much as possible. Jen, have I missed anything else?
No, I think that you've captured it. I think probably the best location to find that information is likely on the Kawartha ATV Association website.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. I wanted to make sure I wasn't going rogue on that one. So thanks for confirming that. Perfect. Wonderful. And I'm just seeing some very nice comments in the chat now that I did actually get it open. So thank you, everybody who's been able to join this evening. This is just the start of the conversation so far. We couldn't be more appreciative of the enthusiasm and the involvement that we're seeing here through this project. We know that there will be some more opportunities, of course, through this process, but also through the active transportation master plan process too. And if there's any questions that come up about how these fit together and how we're approaching them in a way that's complementary, do not hesitate to reach out. We'll be making sure that we are very much coordinating and collaborating the two as much as possible. But as we said before, this is a really great opportunity to focus specifically on off-road trails within the city of Kawartha Lakes. And we've been really trying to focus on a process that complements that and the objectives and the goals of the city and other stakeholders as much as possible over the course of the next couple of months as we continue through our process. So we'll stay online, I guess, a little bit, just in case there's anybody who wants to ask more questions before the 8:30 timeline. If you do need to go, you're welcome to as well. I know time is precious, but anything else that I've missed from my colleagues or Jen at the city?
You've covered it from my end. Thanks so much, Claire. I appreciate the time that your group has spent tonight explaining what we've been doing and what we plan to be doing coming up. So again, I appreciate it, and we'll just reiterate to everyone, we're more than welcome. Everyone's more than welcome to contact you or the team through the website. They can contact me directly as well if that's more convenient. But yeah, we're excited to get the comments and feedback so that we can put a very effective plan together.
So thanks very much, guys. Great detailed work.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for joining. We really appreciate it. I just saw one other comment come through from Peter. Thanks again about the need for consideration around the separation between AT users and ORVs for safety purpose and for the enjoyment of the AT folks as well as other users. And I think that's probably why you've heard me say maybe ad nauseum tonight, safety and comfort. We know that the perception and the reality of what that means for different users is very different. As we work through different trail classification types that we're exploring, design considerations, that is definitely at the forefront, and providing options depending on the space that's available, as well as the conditions and the context, will be something that we are exploring and going to be putting forward for consideration, whether or not that's a multi-use trail that has some separation between the users or something a bit more integrated, what that could look like from a design perspective. All of those options are definitely still on the table for consideration for sure. Wonderful. Okay, I think then I'm going to stop recording at least because I think that we have wrapped up here, and I will stop sharing. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you soon in terms of this process. Oh, I didn't stop recording. Now I'm actually going to